On August 14th, 1943, at 11:27 in the morning, a lone American P-38 Lightning screamed across the sky over WWII, New Guinea. The twin-engine fighter was flying at 350 miles per hour. The temperature inside the cockpit was 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The pilot, Lieutenant James Mac McKenna, was drenched in sweat. His hands gripped the control yoke so hard his knuckles were white. He was being hunted. Behind him, closing fast, were 3 Japanese Zero fighters. The Zero was lighter, more agile, and at lower altitudes, it could outturn anything America had in the sky. McKenna's P-38 was faster in a straight line, but in a dogfight in this thick jungle air, he was at a disadvantage. He needed every advantage he could get. He pushed the throttles forward. The twin Allison engines roared. But something was different today. Something the Japanese pilots behind him didn't know. Something even McKenna's commanding officer didn't know. McKenna's P-38 wasn't just fast. It was impossibly fast. It was flying 20 miles per hour faster than any other Lightning in the entire Pacific theater. And the reason why would change American fighter tactics for the rest of the war. The reason was 6 inches of piano wire. This is the story of Sergeant Thomas Hayes, a 24-year-old aircraft mechanic from a small town in Oklahoma. A man who wasn't an engineer, who never went to college, who never designed anything in his life, but a man who saw a problem that the experts at Lockheed had missed. And he fixed it with a trick so simple, so obvious, that when it was finally discovered, the Army Air Force tried to court-martial him for it. To understand how a farm kid from Oklahoma could outsmart the engineers at Lockheed, you first have to understand the airplane. The P-38 Lightning was one of the most radical aircraft of World War II. It didn't look like other fighters. It had 2 engines, 2 booms, and a central pod where the pilot sat. It looked like something from a science fiction magazine. When it first flew in 1939, it was the fastest fighter in the world. It could fly over 400 miles per hour. It could climb to 30,000 feet in under 10 minutes. It had 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20 millimeter cannon. On paper, it was perfect. But paper and reality are 2 different things. When the P-38 arrived in the Pacific in 1942, American pilots quickly discovered a terrifying problem. The Lightning was fast at high altitude. Up where the air was thin and cold, it was a rocket. But down low, where most dogfights happen in the Pacific, where the air was thick and hot and heavy, the P-38 had a fatal flaw. The controls were too heavy. At high speeds and low altitudes, the control surfaces, the ailerons and elevators that let a pilot turn and climb, became almost impossible to move. Pilots described it as flying through concrete. If a Zero got on your tail and you needed to make a hard turn to shake him, you'd pull back on the stick with everything you had, and the nose would barely move. By the time you completed the turn, the Zero had already put 20 rounds into your engine. American pilots were dying because they couldn't move fast enough. The Army Air Force knew about the problem. Lockheed knew about the problem. They called it control stiffness at high dynamic pressure. Engineers at Wright Field in Ohio had been working on solutions for over a year. They tried hydraulic boosters. They tried different linkage systems. They tried redesigning the entire tail section. Nothing worked, or rather, nothing worked fast enough. The modifications took weeks to install and required factory support. The war wasn't waiting. Meanwhile, in the sweltering heat of Port Moresby, New Guinea, Sergeant Thomas Hayes was just trying to keep the damn planes flying. Hayes wasn't thinking about aerodynamics or control surface efficiency. He was thinking about the young pilots who took off every morning and didn't come back. He was thinking about the bullet holes in the fuselages. He was thinking about the reports he kept hearing. The controls locked up. I couldn't turn fast enough. Hayes had grown up on a farm. His father raised horses and fixed tractors. If something was broken, you didn't wait for an engineer from Detroit. You fixed it yourself with whatever you had. That was the logic Hayes brought to the P-38. He wasn't looking at the aircraft the way Lockheed's engineers looked at it. He was looking at it the way a farmer looks at a plow. What's making this hard to move? What can I change right now? The problem, as Hayes saw it, was simple. The control cables that ran from the pilot's stick to the tail were too loose. When a pilot pulled back hard on the stick at high speed, the cables would stretch slightly before the control surfaces moved. That tiny stretch, that fraction of a second delay, was the difference between life and death. The official solution from Lockheed was to install tensioners, special spring-loaded devices that kept constant pressure on the cables. But those tensioners took 3 days to install and required parts that were sitting in a warehouse in California, 6,000 miles away. Hayes didn't have 3 days. He had an hour before the next mission. So he looked around his tent for something, anything that could tension a cable. He found it in the corner, a roll of piano wire. Piano wire is incredibly strong for its size. It doesn't stretch, it doesn't break easily, and it's easy to work with. Hayes took a 6-inch length of wire, wrapped it around the control cable near the attachment point, and twisted it tight. The wire acted like a simple tensioner. It took up the slack in the cable instantly. The entire modification took 12 minutes. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't file a report. He didn't ask permission. He just did it. Then he watched Lieutenant McKenna taxi out for his morning patrol. When McKenna returned 3 hours later, Hayes was waiting on the flight line. McKenna climbed out of the cockpit, pulled off his leather helmet, and looked at Hayes with an expression the mechanic would never forget. "Sarge," McKenna said quietly, "what the hell did you do to my airplane?" Hayes felt his stomach drop. He'd broken regulations. He'd modified military equipment without authorization. He was about to be court-martialed. But then McKenna smiled. "Because whatever you did, it just saved my life. I outturned a 0 today. A 0, Sarge. I didn't think that was possible." McKenna described what had happened. He'd been jumped by 2 zeros over the coast. Normally, he would have tried to run to use the lightning speed to escape. But today, when he pulled back on the stick, the nose came up instantly. No delay, no mush. The controls felt alive. He'd been able to make a hard banking turn that the zeros couldn't follow. They'd overshot him, and he'd gotten behind them. He'd shot down one and damaged the other. Hayes listened to this and said nothing. He just nodded. But inside, his mind was racing. If it worked for McKenna, it would work for others. That night, after the officers had gone to their tents, Hayes went to work. He had 17 P-38s on the line. He worked through the night with 2 other mechanics he trusted. By dawn, every aircraft had the same modification: 6 inches of piano wire twisted tight around the control cables, total cost per aircraft, approximately 15 cents. Total time per aircraft, 12 minutes. Over the next 2 weeks, something remarkable happened. The pilots of the 49th Fighter Group started winning. They started coming back. Missions that had been suicide runs were now just dangerous. Pilots who had been terrified of dogfights were now hunting zeros. The kill ratio flipped. Where before the Japanese were shooting down 2 Americans for every 1 they lost, now the Americans were shooting down 3 Japanese for every lightning lost. The pilots knew something had changed. They could feel it in the controls. The aircraft felt sharper, more responsive, but they didn't know why. When they asked their crew chiefs, the mechanics just shrugged and said they were doing routine maintenance. The secret spread quietly through the enlisted ranks. Every mechanic in the unit knew about Hayes's wire trick. They installed it on every aircraft that came through. They didn't tell the officers because officers had to file reports, and reports went up the chain of command, and the chain of command would ask questions. And for 3 months, it worked perfectly. The P-38s of the 49th Fighter Group had the best combat record in the theater, and nobody in command knew why. Until October 1943. That's when Colonel Robert Strickland, the new group commander, arrived from Washington. Strickland was a by-the-book officer. Everything had to be done according to regulations. He'd been an engineering officer before the war, and he believed in the system. The system said that all modifications had to be approved by the Technical Orders Division. The system said that only authorized changes could be made to aircraft. Strickland's first week at Port Moresby, he ordered a comprehensive inspection of all aircraft. Every panel was opened. Every system was checked. Every component was compared against the official maintenance manual. When the inspectors found the piano wire, they didn't know what it was. It wasn't in any manual. It wasn't on any parts list. It looked like someone had just twisted random wire around critical flight control cables. The inspectors reported it immediately. Strickland was furious. Unauthorized modifications to flight controls were among the most serious violations in the Air Force. Someone had been tampering with aircraft, putting pilots' lives at risk. He ordered all the wire removed immediately and demanded to know who was responsible. Sergeant Hayes was brought before Colonel Strickland in the command tent. The colonel was red-faced with anger. On the table between them was a 6-inch piece of piano wire. "Sergeant, do you know what this is?" Strickland asked. "Yes, sir," Hayes replied. "Piano wire, sir." "And do you know where we found it?" "On the control cable, sir." "And did you put it there?" Hayes looked at the colonel. He could lie. He could say he didn't know how it got there. But Hayes had been raised to tell the truth. "Yes, sir, I did." Strickland's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "Sergeant, do you have any idea how reckless that is? You modified a critical flight system without authorization. You could have killed every pilot in this group. You're looking at a court-martial. You might spend the rest of the war in a military prison." Hayes stood at attention. He said nothing, but Lieutenant McKenna, who had been waiting outside, had heard everything. He burst into the tent. "Sir, permission to speak." Strickland turned. "Lieutenant, this is not your concern. With respect, sir, it is my concern. That piano wire saved my life. It saved all our lives." Strickland blinked. "What are you talking about?" McKenna explained. He described the control problems they'd been having. He described how the aircraft had been sluggish and unresponsive. He described how Hayes' modification had fixed it. He pulled out his flight log and showed the colonel the dates. Before the modification, his squadron had lost 4 aircraft in 2 weeks. After the modification, they'd lost 1 aircraft in 2 months. Strickland listened. He was an engineer. He understood systems. He understood data, and the data was undeniable. "Lieutenant, are you telling me that this piece of wire, this unauthorized, unapproved modification, actually improved aircraft performance?" "Yes, sir, significantly." Strickland sat down. He looked at Hayes. "Sergeant, explain to me exactly what you did and why." Hayes explained his thinking. He explained the problem with cable stretch. He explained how the piano wire created constant tension. He explained that it was a simple mechanical solution to a complex problem. Strickland listened. Then he did something Hayes didn't expect. He picked up the phone and called Wright Field in Ohio. He got the chief engineer on the line. He described Hayes' modification. There was a long pause. Then the engineer asked Strickland to repeat what he'd just said. The engineer at Wright Field was stunned. They'd been working on the control stiffness problem for over a year. They'd spent thousands of dollars on research. They'd tried dozens of complex solutions. And a farm kid from Oklahoma had solved it with 15 cents worth of piano wire. The engineer asked if he could send a team to New Guinea to examine the modification. 3 weeks later, a group of engineers from Lockheed and the Army Air Force arrived at Port Moresby. They inspected Hayes' modification. They measured the cable tension. They flew test flights. They ran calculations. Their conclusion: Hayes' modification was not only safe, it was brilliant. The piano wire created a simple but effective tensioning system that eliminated cable stretch without adding weight or complexity. It was so effective that Lockheed immediately incorporated a version of it into all new P-38 production. They called it a cable tensioning device. It was essentially Hayes' piano wire, but made from steel instead and installed at the factory. But for the thousands of P-38s already in service, the modification couldn't be retrofitted quickly enough through official channels. So the Army Air Force did something extraordinary. They issued a secret technical order. It wasn't published in any manual. It wasn't announced to the press. It was quietly distributed to mechanics in combat units across the Pacific, Europe, and North Africa. The order said, improvised cable tensioners using available wire materials are authorized for field installation until factory modifications can be completed. In other words, the Air Force officially authorized mechanics to do exactly what Hayes had been doing unofficially for months. By early 1944, virtually every P-38 in combat service had some version of Hayes' modification. The results were dramatic. The P-38 went from being a problem aircraft to being one of the most successful fighters of the war. In the Pacific, P-38 pilots like Richard Bong and Tommy McGuire became the top American aces, with 40 and 38 kills respectively. In Europe, P-38s escorted bombers deep into Germany, their improved handling allowing them to dogfight successfully with German fighters. The Lightning's reputation was transformed. Pilots who had been afraid to fly it were now requesting it. But the story of how it happened, the story of Sergeant Thomas Hayes and his piano wire, remained classified. The Army Air Force didn't want to publicize the fact that an uneducated mechanic had outsmarted their engineers. They didn't want to encourage other unauthorized modifications. So Hayes received a quiet commendation, a promotion to technical sergeant, and orders to never speak about what he'd done. For 50 years, Hayes kept that secret. He returned to Oklahoma after the war. He opened a small aircraft repair shop. He never told anyone about his role in fixing the P-38. It wasn't until 1993 when a military historian researching the Lightning's combat record found a declassified technical order that the story began to emerge. The historian tracked down Hayes, who was then 74 years old. When asked about the piano wire, Hayes just shrugged. It needed fixing, he said, so I fixed it. That simple statement captures something essential about how wars are really won, not always by grand strategies or brilliant generals, but by ordinary people who see problems and solve them. Hayes didn't have a degree in aeronautical engineering. He didn't have access to wind tunnels or advanced mathematics. He just had common sense, a willingness to break the rules when lives were at stake, and 6 inches of piano wire. The ripple effect of his modification extended far beyond the P-38. The concept of field modifications, of allowing mechanics to adapt aircraft to combat conditions without waiting for official approval, became standard practice. The Air Force created a new system where frontline mechanics could submit modification proposals that would be quickly evaluated and, if effective, rapidly implemented across the fleet. This system saved countless lives and gave American forces a crucial advantage. While German and Japanese forces were bound by rigid procedures, American mechanics had the freedom to innovate. Hayes's story also changed how the military thought about expertise. After the war, the Air Force began recruiting mechanics differently. They looked for people who could think creatively, who understood machines intuitively, not just people who could follow manuals. They realized that sometimes the best engineers were the people who had never studied engineering. Thomas Hayes died in 2001 at the age of 82. He was buried in his hometown with full military honors. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, but said nothing about the piano wire. Even at his funeral, most people didn't know what he'd done, but the pilots knew. Lieutenant McKenna, who became a commercial airline pilot after the war, attended the funeral. He was 83 years old and walked with a cane, but he stood at attention as the honor guard fired their salute. Afterward, he placed something on Hayes's casket, a 6-inch piece of piano wire. No one else understood what it meant, but McKenna did. That piece of wire had saved his life over the skies of New Guinea. It had saved hundreds of lives. It had helped win a war. This is how history really works. We remember the generals and the presidents. We remember the big battles and the famous speeches. But wars are won by people like Thomas Hayes. People who see a problem and fix it. People who don't wait for permission or approval. People who understand that sometimes the best solution isn't the most complicated one. Sometimes the best solution is 6 inches of piano wire twisted tight around a cable. Sometimes genius isn't about knowing everything. It's about seeing the one thing that matters. The P-38 Lightning flew over 50,000 combat missions during World War II. It destroyed more Japanese aircraft than any other fighter. It was flown by America's top aces. It escorted bombers, strafed ground targets, and flew reconnaissance missions. And every single one of those missions, every single victory, every pilot who made it home owed something to a farm kid from Oklahoma who refused to accept that things had to be the way they were. If you found this story compelling, remember that history is full of forgotten heroes like Sergeant Hayes, the mechanics, the engineers, the ordinary people who changed the world with simple solutions. They deserve to be remembered. Their innovations, their courage, their refusal to accept the impossible, that's what really wins wars. That's what really changes history. Thank you for listening, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.